Hi, my name is Mark Stallard. Welcome to Little Green Man. This is part 4 in our 7-part series on the balance the budget doctrine. If you haven't checked out videos 1 through 3, I sincerely suggest you check them out right now. That'll catch you up. I will not be doing too much by the way of recap. So where does religiously balancing the budget take us? What is the direction? Well, so far it's taking us to through a cycle of cutting taxes and cutting public services, making life less enjoyable and less livable in many respects and more expensive for working people. And this is something that we call austerity. Now, of the services that are being cut, I think it's important that we kind of look at what has been cut and what is going to be cut. And maybe as I look at a few of these things, you can have an idea of just how devastating this could be, particularly for working people. So areas that have already been cut and will be cut if we continue along this path of austerity is in schools. Okay, special needs funding, so if someone has a learning disability, those services are almost cut right off the top. It happened in England. Pretty much anything particularly with mental health in schools was almost completely removed. Payroll reduction, so less salaries, lower salaries for teachers, fewer teachers, more children for the classroom. There'll be less money for books and equipment, and maybe some semesters and even some years, maybe there won't be any new books or equipment. Moving on to the police service, again, we're going to be a cycle here of lowering salaries, cutting positions, and even some automation, particularly with regards to red light cameras. We've seen that happen. There will be fewer patrols. I mean, look out the window. How many police cars did you used to see in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s? And now look at how many police cars are out on patrol now. Very, very few. It's rare to actually see them, and it's really absolutely noticeable in the UK. I was there last Christmas, and the whole time I was there for 2 weeks, I saw 2 police cars, 2! And one of those was leaving a police station. And that's not a joke, I'm not exaggerating, that is actually what happened. And we're moving on to healthcare. We've already suffered from emergency rooms being cut in half. That cut has already happened. The reducing of the medical mental health services, if not cut them. And again, we're going to have this cycle of lowering salaries, lowering the pay and then cutting the number of nurses and doctors, less medical equipment, emergency rooms. I've always said that, cut in half. Now think about that in prisons and fire services. And those similar kinds of cuts, if those happen, could be absolutely disastrous. And then, of course, we come into the more personal things, sanitation, trash removal. That's been privatized for a long time. We're not getting the greatest service there, and I don't think anyone really ever has. And as private companies get a hold of those, they'll be trying to cut corners wherever they can. More on that on other videos, though. Then, of course, we got issues with clean water, potential. We're already checks and tests on the water and on the environment have already been cut by the Palestinian government. Certainly moves towards that in this anti-red tape legislation that they're forcing through. Cuts to libraries, maybe they'll not just be cut, maybe they'll be abolished. Unemployment, welfare, poverty programs, these are all programs to help the poor, will be cut and reduced. And of course then roads and bridges and other infrastructure as well will be cut, which could be devastating. Even to industry, if you think it through. So in reality, look at all those things we just said. I spent a lot of time on the types of services that are going to be cut. This is not exhaustive, but it gives you a very good idea of how far-reaching these cuts could be and how far they've been in other countries. So it actually will hurt those people in the middle class, those people who travel to and from work, who are that are doing the real work and that need those public services to survive and certainly to make lives better, if not to keep you safe, like the police and the fire service and the health service that keep you alive. If you want to take that to one extreme, absolutely, they will keep you alive. But on the other hand, it doesn't really affect the super rich people who pay less taxes anyway, because they can actually afford most of these services themselves. private schools, they have private, potentially private hospitals and so on and so forth. Even private police. That is actually a thing of these private security companies that rich and powerful people employ. So what this really is austerity. It's tightening the belt. It's making life a little more harder for working people. But it doesn't. It's not it's austerity, not austerity. The opposite for corporations and the rich people that own them. David Camfield had written in a CBC article, "We can see this clearly in what's happened in Greece in recent years. Wave after wave of cuts and neoliberal reforms have hacked away at jobs, wages, services and rights, leaving most people worse off. And so it's created what some are calling a great divide between the rich and the poor. The rich have got super rich, and the poor are getting poorer and poorer. And even the middle class are becoming, at least financially, they're becoming a working class, not really in the middle at all. Employers are also in on the act, at least at one level or another, with austerity being in place and cuts everywhere. That since the 1980s, that the average worker's pay has not gone up according to the cost of living. It has not kept pace with inflation. So they're actually being paid proportionally less now than they were in the 1980s. The numbers may go up, but everything else has gone up at a far higher rate, meaning less money. Work conditions have got worse because of lax employment laws, although health and safety in Canada isn't too bad, but we've got employment laws that the only way, all I have to do as an employer, if you're an employee of mine, by Manitoba law, is to say to you, here's your 2 weeks notice, you're gone. I don't even need to give a reason, you're gone. That is the law. And of course, then the unions have been depowered as well to one degree or another. Pallister has already signed this year back to work legislation to take power away from unions. This is a neoliberal trick to put keep the power in the hands of the rich and the powerful corporations and the rich people that own them. And this whole situation leaves people to no choice but to bridge the gap between their needs and maybe a few luxuries, and even living with housing and transportation, getting into debt, and then because debt is so cheap, now paying off debt with debt so you can get a car and have the extra debt added onto it. So now debt is far bigger than the assets that people have. A very dangerous place. It's a debt bubble. It already popped to a degree in 2008 in the US. It's going to happen here with housing and with the car loans and loans in general. It's going to pop, and it's not a matter of will it, it's when it. Bubbles will pop. They're going to. So we'll see down the road how far away that is if something isn't done about it soon. Well then, with all of this then, let's kind of move on. Is austerity good for the economy? Now, I'm not an economist, but I know a man who is. Mark Blyth, Eastman Professor of Political Economy, the Watson Institute for International Studies and Brown University. He testified at a Senate hearing, budget hearing in the US on March 11th, 2015. And in writing about this, he has this to say: the result in Europe has been plain to see, a massive contraction in economic activity, with those that cut the most seeing the steepest collapse in growth, and paradoxically, the build-up in debts. This is hardly a surprise historically, since pretty much all attempts to balance budgets have resulted in recessions or depressions. Sources in the description. So then, maybe we're not giving austerity enough time, or maybe we should give it longer. Well, there are some of us that think that 1980s, and in the UK it was 1979 this started to happen. I think 40 odd years, it's almost 40 years. I think that's enough time. And I think enough is enough. Now, Mark Blyth went on to say in his book, Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea, says, the British are in as bad shape as anyone else, despite their tightening, and the United Kingdom's economic indicators are very much pointing the wrong way, showing again that austerity hurts rather than helps. So if public services are poor, and some of them may not even be available, people are going to have to pay for them out of pocket. Or they can go without. And of course, if you have to go into debt just to have transport to go to work, and you're in debt up to your eyeballs, the chances are you're not going to be able to afford to pay for any of those services, and you will have no option but to go without. Rich people certainly will not go without. So the last question, very quickly here, what then is the real destination of austerity if it isn't for a stronger economy? Well, the public services can be run into the ground, so that the public, the citizens can see that those public services don't work, they're painful to use, there's an unpleasant experience. And then, particularly as they start hurting and they start needing relief, they'll start grasping out for straws. There are some political ramifications for this. We're seeing some of it in the US and in Europe. France, for instance, almost elected a right-wing fascist after less than 100 years after they were occupied by the Nazis. This is how bad it's getting there. But from a purely economic point of view, it would be easier for the people in control to take those public services and to privatize them. So the question then I'll leave you with, which I will answer in part 5, is this. If austerity isn't working, then could privatization be the solution? And we'll find out in part 5. Little Green Man.